Imagine you're about to embark on a sea voyage. It will be a long journey, the seas could be stormy, and the trip is dangerous. Now, who you want making the decisions? Anyone on board or a trained captain? Probably the captain, right? Using a case similar to the ship analogy, Socrates argued that voting, either directly or for representatives, requires a kind of knowledge and skill that not everyone possesses, and giving those people without the skill the power to vote could lead to the equivalent of a societal shipwreck. But was Socrates' perspective fair, or at least justified? This video will be divided into two parts. In the first part, we begin with a concrete, historically grounded analysis of the Athenian system. Here, we will conduct research into Athenian democracy through the sources, both modern and ancient, such as Aristotle, Demosthenes, and Xenophon, in order to understand whether Socrates' criticism on democracy was fair or not. In the second part, we will be focusing on a debate between Socrates and Protagoras, drawn from a dialogue written by Plato. This debate approaches the question of a democracy from a philosophical perspective. In order to understand whether Socrates' perspective was right, we have to understand first how democracy in ancient Athens worked and how magistrates were appointed. In fact, Athenian democracy relied on two main methods to appoint public officials: the election and sortition. The election, which involved direct voting by the citizen body and was typically reserved for positions that required specific expertise, experience, or leadership skills, such as the generals. The sortition, on the other hand, was considered the most generally and democratic method. It worked for random selection among all eligible citizens, and thus ensured that every man, regardless of social status, had an equal chance to participate in public life. This aroused the irony of Socrates, who, in Xenophon's words, written in the Memorabilia, declared that it was silly that the rulers of the city should be appointed by sortition, but no one would be willing to appoint a pilot, a carpenter, or a flautist, chosen by sortition. But Socrates' comment is not altogether fair. There are four main reasons why his perspective might be biased. Firstly, it was not every state officer who was chosen by sortition, but only those charged with limited routine duties, for which little more than a sense of decency and fair play was required. Secondly, it must be remembered that any magistrate had to pass a preliminary examination, which was, in fact, usually formal, but still gave his enemies an opportunity for racking up his past. Thirdly, a magistrate or state officer was liable to be deposed by a vote of the assembly, taken 10 times a year. And fourthly, after his year as a magistrate, he was subject to a scrutiny, in which his financial accounts and conduct in office were reviewed, and any citizen could charge him with inefficiency or abuse of authority. This scrutiny was called euthena. So eventually, it was very unlikely that many rogues or fools would expose themselves to these risks. In reality, in the 4th century Athens, all the important magistrates, like the 10 generals, who not only commanded the army and the fleet, but exercised a general control over defense and foreign policy, as well as the other military commanders and the principal financial and diplomatic magistrates, were elected by the people, a procedure which could be regarded as aristocratic, as also stated by Aristotle in the 4th book of his Politics. For example, the appointment of magistrates by lot is thought to be democratical, and the election of them oligarchical. Election as an aristocratic way to elect people. How come, you might ask? This because election, by its very nature, implies a selection based on competence or wealth. In ancient world, these two were deeply intertwined, since only those with significant wealth possessed the time required to cultivate an adequate education. Therefore, the choice was limited to the most affluent people, rather than being open up to the entire population at random, as again stated by Aristotle in his Politics. The citizens must not lead the life of mechanics or tradesmen, for such a life is ignoble, and inimical to virtue. Neither must they be husbandmen, since leisure is necessary for both the development of virtue and the performance of political duties. In fact, in the 4th century Athens, it was very common that in important military, diplomatic, and financial offices, men of birth and wealth were generally elected. But how do we know that? Modern research is essential to assess the reality of Athenian democracy. Epigraphic contributions to the socio-political history of Athens in the age of Demosthenes is one of the most significant works in this field. Written by Johannes Sundwall, a Finnish historian who performed a prosopographical study of the 1st century Athens. This means he looked at the names of every person recorded in inscriptions who held office, served as a general, or proposed a decree. Therefore, he was able to map exactly which families held onto power during the age of Demosthenes. Unfortunately, Sundwall's book is only available in German, so I personally translated the sections that I deemed most relevant to this research. You will find the English translation following the German original text. Specifically, I found two concluding passages from the book particularly interesting. In the first one, Sundwall discusses the views of Belloc, a German historian convinced of the existence of radical democracy, the idea according to which the poor masses held the power in Athens during democracy. Regarding the period after the king's peace, Belloc admits that the propertied classes were very well able to exert a decisive influence on the leadership of the state, and even if only they wanted to, why should they not have wanted to later as well? And when, then, would the era of lower class have begun? So even Belloc, a firm proponent of the idea of radical democracy, admits that the wealthy elite still held the upper hand throughout democracy. In this last passage, Sundwall gives his own conclusive and decisive views on Athenian democracy. To emphasize once again the most important result of my arguments, the political influence of the propertied classes of Athens was by no means diminished during the time of Demosthenes. In the most important branches of administration, in the council as generals or as financial officials, the propertied classes held the upper hand. Even the orators and politicians belonged throughout to the higher strata of the citizenry. The political parties had not emerged from the opposition of the properties to the non-propertied, but rather from different views regarding foreign policy and economic and personal conflicts of interest connected with it. What he discovered was that only a few families held the most prominent magistracies. This confirms that wealth was indeed a decisive factor, if not the most important one, to hold a high-ranking public office in ancient Athens. It was comparatively rare that a self-made man like Phrynichus or Aeschines achieved significant political influence. To further reinforce this point, we can take a look at a primary ancient source like On the Crown, one of the most famous orations of the Athenian politician and orator Demosthenes, delivered in 330 BC. In this oration, Demosthenes confronts his rival, Aeschines, previously mentioned, using the man's humble origins as a class weapon, we could say. Shall I first say how your father Thromes was loaded with his chain and lug, when a slave to Alpius, who taught grammar at the temple of Theseus, or how your mother, by those marriages daily repeated, in her cell near the hero Calamides, maintained this noble figure, this accomplished actor or third characters. So he basically mocks and denigrates him, pointing out the fact that his father was a lowly teacher and his mother a cult priestess, to convince the jury that he was unworthy of representing the interests of Athens. But the fact that Demosthenes used this strategy proves that the jurors, who were regular citizens chosen by sortition, still held a deep-seated respect for the traditional eupatrides, the hereditary aristocracy and land-owning elite of ancient Athens, with eu meaning good, well, and patrides meaning fathers, literally translating to the well-born or those with good fathers. Another primary source we can take a look at is again the Memorabilia. These are a collection of Socratic dialogues written by Xenophon. In the dialogue, the author records the complaints of Nicomachides, an experienced soldier who has been beaten in the election by the generalship by a rich man, Demosthenes, who knows nothing about military affairs. "They elect not me," he went on, "but, if you please, Demosthenes, who never served as an hoplite in his life, nor in the cavalry ever made a brilliant stroke that I ever heard tell of. No, in fact, he has got no science at all, I take it, except to amass stores of wealth." Nicomachides claimed that the only reason he was elected was because of his wealth. And so, in the end, democracy was not able to change the system altogether. In fact, it was not the poor and incompetent to be elected, like Socrates feared, but rather the rich, but still incompetent, to be elected. And I'll just leave this here, cause after 2 millennia, this still sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? A counter-argument to Socrates' view is put into the mouth of Protagoras by Plato in his dialogue called Protagoras, in particular in a passage which so well illustrates the tone of the Athenian assembly that is worth taking a look. In the dialogue, Socrates is expressing his doubts as to whether political wisdom is teachable, and it goes as it follows. "I," Socrates says, "think that the Athenians are wise. I observe that when we are met together in the assembly, and the manner in hand relates to building, the builders are summoned as advisors. When the question is one of shipbuilding, then the shipwrights, and the like of other arts which they think capable of being taught and learned. And if some person offers to give them advice who is not supposed by them to have any skill in the art, even though he be good-looking and rich and noble, they will not listen to him." And so continues. "But when the question is an affair of state, then everybody is free to have a say. Carpenter, tinker, cobbler, sailor, passenger, rich and poor, high and low, anyone who likes gets up, and no one reproaches him, as in the former case, with not having learned and having no teacher, and yet giving advice, evidently because they are under the impression that this sort of knowledge cannot be taught." To this argument, Protagoras replies in a mythological form, claiming that Zeus, when he created man, gave various talents to each, but to all he gave a sense of reverence and justice, since without them any society would be impossible. We can clearly read this personal wish of Zeus in this conversation he has with Hermes. "Shall this be the manner in which I am to distribute justice and reverence among men, or shall I give them to all?" "To all," said Zeus. "I should like them all to have a share, for cities cannot exist if a few only share in the virtues, as in the arts." So Socrates, Protagoras concludes, "And this is the reason, Socrates, why the Athenians and mankind in general, when the question relates to carpentering or any other mechanical art, allow but a few to share in their deliberations, and when anyone else interferes, then, as you say, they object, if he be not of the favourite few, which, as I reply, is very natural. But when they meet to deliberate about political virtue, which proceeds only by way of justice and wisdom, they are patient enough of any man who speaks of them, as is also natural, because they think that every man ought to share in this sort of virtue, and that states could not exist if this were otherwise. I have explained to you, Socrates, the reason of this phenomenon." Protagoras' argument is profound. Political wisdom, in his eyes, is not a technical skill you learn from a master. It is a foundational human capability. Protagoras agrees with Socrates that no one should listen to a carpenter discussing architecture, but regarding the city itself, the carpenter's moral compass is just as valid as the aristocrat's. This passage is one of the earliest and strongest defense of universal suffrage, even though restricted to the rigid requirements of Athenian citizenship. it suggests that the legitimacy of a democracy doesn't rest on every citizen being an expert in economics or law, but rather on the shared human capacities we all possess as human beings. This leaves us with a fundamental question. Is there a universal moral compass given to us all, as Protagoras suggests, or is ethics a purely subjective invention that varies from one individual to the other? And this brings us once again to the end of this video. You can find all the sources in the description below, and if you liked the video and appreciated the effort to share all this information with you, I would be very grateful if you could subscribe to the channel, and also feel free to leave a like and a comment. Yeah, that would help me a lot to grow the channel. And yeah, thanks for watching. See you next time.